I don't know how to, put it into words. Just incredible. It's 10 more levels deep of understanding with what you write in your books. It's beautiful. But I wanted to ask you a couple questions. One is not as quite as whatever. Lindsay Williams was saying, "Oh, we're double crossing the Arabs," but you were saying in your book in the Priori of Sion.
Yeah.
Basically, it's the Mohammedans, the British royal family, and the Jews that are part of the whole ring of power at the top. Is that correct?
Yeah. Wells goes into that, H.G. Wells, because even before him, but he copied the same system that basically economists had drafted up before. When they were planning this new world for the 20th and 21st centuries, H.G. Wells drafted up a list of favored races, an idea that came from Darwin himself, in fact. And favored races were those who were the most successful in society. And success meant rising above poverty, gaining lots of wealth and power and holding on to it. And so he drafted up a list of them, ones who would be brought through into the new system. And he mentioned that some of the British, not all of them, he was talking about the upper class, they would come through. Wealthy Jews would come through, those, he was talking about Rothschilds and so on, and he had to do that because that was one of his, the guys who helped pay him. But anyway, he also had a list of people who would have to be eliminated, because they kept rebelling, they didn't like being dominated and so on. And it always caused trouble against invading armies down through history. And the Irish and the Scottish happened to be on that list as well. So were the American Indians. And if you go further back too, you'll find an economists in the 1700s who were writing about the Americas. They drafted up the same list for the Americas. The Indians would not come through. They would not adapt into this economic system. And Wells also said the same thing, that those blacks who could emulate the white man in economic ways and success, they would be brought through. The rest would also be eliminated. So you have to adapt or die, which again is one of the primary tenets of Darwinism and evolution. So
are these same people part of the? I understand you said they've killed off most of the Mer of Finnegan line, but the Carolingian line are basically now the nobility and the royalty?
There's no doubt about that. I mean, even today, they go into these genealogies, and sometimes you'll find that this odd thing happens when they pick, for instance, a lieutenant general or governor for Canada who speaks on behalf of the Queen's representative in her dominions, which is up in Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and so on. When you go into their coat of arms, like the last one it was actually, they had symbols there from the Merovingians family tree. I thought that was rather interesting. So you'll see it in symbology. You understand, these characters will give you more in symbology than they will ever in the written word. And that's how they can put things right in plain sight. And most folk don't understand, because they can't come out and just admit what they're up to or what they've been up to all this time. And if you go back into Pythagoras, for instance, and even Plato, these guys all were trained in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, in the mystery religions, it was only one stopping place. Because we find in Herodotus, he talks about it. We find, again, Plato too talks about it. You went for initiation in Egypt, and then you went to India in ancient times for a higher or more education in the mystery religions. And then you went to the Levant, as it's called, that area of Jerusalem and so on. And then you came back. But what Egypt exported mainly was revolution in other countries which they did not already control. That's an interesting concept. And Pythagoras himself, when he went back to open up his school after being in Egypt and being taught, his school was burned down when the people realized that he was trying to get the young students to turn against the parents and the old society, to destroy the old society. And they even taught, they brought in females too, and they had to marry them off, try to marry them off to noble people, noble families, and start to influence the decision-making policies and politics and so on. When that was found out, they turned against him. And that time, he went to Crotona, to open school. It was a part of Italy at the time. That was the Greek Empire. And they burned it down. And the same thing happened eventually with other philosophers from the same school who were all taught in Egypt. You all know about drinking of the hemlock for Socrates, for instance. And Socrates, too, was also blamed for trying to corrupt the youth. What it was again, same technique. He would also teach the young females in education, basically how to seduce the nobility, get them in, get them married, influence policy, and also how to overthrow the ruling establishment of his time. And then when you follow it up into the Neoplatonic movement that broke out in about AD 300 in Alexandria, it was the same thing. Fascinating writings came out at that time, about AD 300, of the same group, a continuation of the same group, where philosophy was to be the main religion, and philosophy would rule through academia and eventually through revolution, always turning the young against parents, through millennia, if need be, to bring in a world where they themselves, the best suited, the wise men, if you like, would rule the world because the public were just too stupid to do it themselves. And they also believed in a form of evolution long before Darwin, because it was closely linked. The philosophies were closely linked, as I say, with not only Egypt, but that also of India. And if you look into Hinduism, there's not much difference in their understanding of evolution, from slime and so on into insects and creatures, then people. There's not much difference between that and Darwin. So there's a definite connection. So there's been something come down.
That belief.
Pardon?
There was evolution, because that was another thing that really woke me up, is that you said believing in evolution is like a religion.
Yes. Yeah.
And I just because I never liked the dogma of Christianity, I just kind of pushed it out there, and that evolution was always fact.
Yes.
And since then, I've been kind of looking into or listening to, like, Dr. Stan Monteith. He had somebody on, and it was like, you realize Mount Rushmore was made not by wind and ice, but by an artist, by a designer, and yet the human body, that's just so amazingly fantastic, was so much. It was put together just by chance, and that didn't make sense. But who would you say would be the best book to read to really show that there's not really fact behind evolution?
You won't get it all in one book, and this is the problem with, knowledge is deliberately scattered. Deliberately, and I mean that, it's deliberately scattered. That's what publishing houses are for. And that's also what George Orwell found out when he tried to publish a couple of his books. Even though he had contracts with those publishers, which they technically couldn't break, they turned on him when he wanted to write Animal Farm and 1984, which really was called The Last Man, was the title he wanted for it. But they turned on him because he was exposing the techniques of this ruling elite for world domination, and that communism and fascism all work together to come into the same road using the dialectic process. So he realized that the publishing houses were not there to put out anything to the public that they didn't want out to the public. And so the knowledge truly is scattered. And that's why it takes so long to go through lots of old books and get a paragraph here and there that stands out, like it just hits you between the eyes when you come across some amazing statements with the factual stuff behind it, in amongst all the boring stuff. And that's how they give you the knowledge. But you can certainly go into university books, for instance, on the philosophers of Greece, and also the Neo-Platonic movement, I should say, Platonism, and find out what their philosophies were. They actually promoted feminism as well, and lesbianism too. And one of their famous teachers was a lesbian who did some amazing things in class which were rather disgusting to the people, to shock them, for shock value. The very same thing that professors will do today, in fact, to shock students. They were actually doing them in AD 300. So there's a common thread down through time. What's interesting too with Pythagoras, he had about 4 years when you joined him of silence. He couldn't speak, just like monks. And in fact, the whole idea of the monkhoods came from Pythagoras, even in the Christian era, of 4 years of silence. And even then you were still being watched to see if you were worthy, and then they allowed you in. So it's quite fantastic to read them. The Essenes too in Israel, in ancient Jerusalem, seem to be part of that same sect, or definitely connected with it. Same techniques. Back with more after this break. Hi folks, we're back, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix, and we'll try and fit in Rich from Virginia, if he's there. Is Rich still there? You lost him. Okay. Is Lucretia gone?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, you're still there. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I had two other questions on Israel. Mm-hmm. I wasn't quite sure if that stood for the three families that basically have kept control.
Israel is looked upon in different ways. Israel is remember too, there's no definite mention of a place called Israel from the Persians, the Egyptians, or any of the other empires in those days. There's no mention at all of a place called Israel. All we have really is the what's called the 5 books of Moses, or the Old Testament, mentioning it at all. So eventually too, they used to call them Hebrews at one time, and then they called them Jews much later on, really with the birth of a people coming out of Babylon. That's all we can really verify, is that people came out of Babylon who supposedly had been slaves, and they were freed, and they went to this place and created that much later. So there's a lot of debates, even from professors in Israel, about the history. There's professors who say there was no Solomon, there was no David, these are myths and so on. And Israel is more of a system, if you look at it overall. It's a system.
I guess because, you teach so much about that you got a lot of your history by understanding where words came from. Mm-hmm. And I appreciated so much of, being able to decipher words and seeing Ham in a name, or, or all the different things, and even just down to some of the numerology. It was fascinating. But, mm-hmm. Like Isis, and then, Ray and El, or Solomon, son.
Yeah.
I didn't know if there was some other significance to the Israel and the...
Well, Israel also is you have the first 2 letters, which is typically Kabbalistic, by the way. The first 2 letters are often used in names. And you have IS for Isis, and you have Ari for Ra, and El is an ancient Semitic god that they used to believe in. So you have the same thing once again, over and over. Isis, Osiris, basically, it's the same as Osiris and the offspring. You have the same thing with Nimrod too, Semiramis, and the offspring once again. It's a trinity, always with a god, and then a goddess, and then the offspring. And this is very symptomatic of the same kind of system down through time. So it's a combination of that Isis, Ra, and El. And sometimes I joke and I say, "Is it real? Is Israel real?" So you have all of that written into it. But it's a system. It's a system that comes down through time. It doesn't matter if it's a place or a people or a religion. It's a system coming down through time that has it fixed into its belief system that only it must survive. It doesn't matter what the cost is. It must survive. And some of them say it's because they were overrun so many times, being in the crossroads of invading armies going one way or another, that they turned inwards and built up a hatred towards other peoples to consolidate their system. And that may be true, but we do know that the Talmud, which is the main set of books that they go by, not the Old Testament or 5 books of Moses, but the Talmud is their guide and has helped them survive for all this time down to the present. So it comes down in a time capsule with a system with its own survival being preeminent over anything else that happens in the world. The nations come and go, but Israel is forever. That's what that means. And it's a deep truth in there. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling. From Hamish myself from Ontario, Canada, is good night to me. Your God or your gods go with you.